In this video, I want to talk about the 4 levels of reading. It comes from the book How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. And it's a book that I wish that I had discovered while I was in high school or college, because most of the reading that I did up until graduate school, and even probably some of it in graduate school, was at a really shallow level of reading because I didn't really understand the differences of reading. To me, reading was a job to do, and the objective was to get as much information as possible. Usually, the information was useful only insofar as I had an exam to take. In some cases, reading was also useful for entertainment or humor. I was trying to read stories and be entertained by them. But in terms of changing my character, changing my personality, or progressing my understanding, pushing that forward, it wasn't really happening. I wasn't able to use books that way. I didn't understand how, or even that it was possible. So one of my first experiences of being confronted by a book that I didn't understand came after college, and that should tell you something about the reading that I did in college. It wasn't that I did no reading in college. It was that I never approached a book with the idea that it had something to do to improve me, or was capable of changing who I was. I came into reading these books throughout my undergraduate experience as I already know a lot, so let me see how this shows me what I already know. And so I came into the book with knowledge, and then I just looked for what confirmed that knowledge. There wasn't any actual transformation. And I was really staying at the level of knowledge. Oh, I thought this was true. Okay, it's not true. This is true instead. But there was no development of who I was. I wasn't changing as a person through this process. But that changed while I was at the library. This was Grand Rapids Public Library, and I had just discovered phenomenology, or phenomenological philosophy, which was a school of European thought that was begun in the beginning of the 20th century and continued really strong up through the 60s. But some of the figures were Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, a student, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, another student of Husserl's, Emmanuel Levinas, and there were several others that were really interested in studying experience, lived experience, subjectivity, and as a psychology student, that was really fascinating to me. And so, looking at some of these articles, I kept coming across the same name, Martin Buber, in a book that he wrote called I and Thou. And I found it in the library. It was really short, so I thought, oh, I can read this in an afternoon or in a weekend. And I read through it really quickly, and I didn't understand any of it. It just completely went over my head. I saw how many people this book had influenced, but I was incapable of getting anything from it. I went to it looking for gems or little bits of wisdom, and it was just about as insightful as a wheelbarrow full of dirt. And so it was just stuff. It was just full of words. It didn't mean anything to me. I was incapable of facing it at the level that the author was writing. So the author had something to give me, and I was incapable of getting it. And so in order to reach that point, I would have to transform. I would have to change who I was. I would have to grow as a reader. I'd have to grow as a thinker. And it was that moment that I realized that I wanted to go to graduate school for the only reason of learning how to interpret that work. And so he was writing, at least the book that I had was translated into English. He may not have originally been writing it. Buber may not have originally been writing in English. I know he was a Hasidic Jew, but I'm not sure if he was writing in Hebrew or German, or if he was writing in English. But anyway, I was reading an English translation, but even still, I lacked the resources, the skills, the understanding to read it. So if I ever got to the point where I could read Buber's I and Thou, I know I would have grown as a reader. My ability to think and analyze will have increased. And so that was just an experience that I had that showed me that I had room for improvement. And so what I want to do in this video is say the same thing, or make the same case for you if you are a college student, if you are a graduate student, or if you are a teacher or professor who wants to encourage their students to read at a deeper level. We could also say a higher or more sophisticated level. Or in other words, how to practice analytical thinking skills through the process of reading. So I'm going to go through Adler's 4 levels of reading in this video and how they differ from one another. Now, he's very careful to say levels because they're not types, they're not separate from each other. They're levels, so each subsequent one has the first one included in it. So you'll see here the first level is elementary reading, and the second level is inspectional reading. But inspectional reading requires that you're able to read at an elementary level. So it's not like you leave the one behind and move on to level 2. Level 1 is included in level 2, and levels 1 and 2 are included in level 3, which is analytical reading. That's what I was incapable of doing with Martin Buber. Finally, there's synoptical reading, or syntopical reading. Not a great word. I think Adler was showing off some of his Latin root words here. Comparative reading, being able to see where one book fits into the context of multiple books, and bring all of those things together in order to draw deeper insights that aren't available in any one book, but can only be understood when comparing them all together. Adler has an interesting story himself. So he was reading and writing and teaching literature and writing in college at the college level, but he co-taught a class with Charles Van Doren, who was a poet, and he tells in the preface to at least the second edition, I'm not sure if this was part of the first edition, but he talks about how he listened to Van Doren read a passage, and it was as if Van Doren was interacting with the author. And so here Mortimer Adler's thinking, I'm this expert reader, right? I teach this for a living. I write about this. I'm a professional. I'm a professor of it. And then here's someone else, a colleague of his that he esteems and admires, that is reading the same essay or the same short story, but reading it in a very different way, as if responding directly to the author, feeling the author, expressing something, being impacted by the author. It was almost as if a relationship was happening. And then Adler realized, oh my goodness, I haven't been doing that at all. I've been missing out on this whole process. Adler, in retrospect, realized he wasn't doing analytical reading. He was reading a book, and then he would say, so for example, he could read his own book, How to Read a Book, and then say, all right, what does that say? Well, I know a lot about reading, and so I can pull from like these philosophers and these literary scholars, and I can interpret it through their words. So what I'm really doing is taking all this knowledge I already have, and I'm just using it to cover over what the author is trying to say. There is no impact that the book has on him directly, so there isn't an actual impact. I'm not engaging the book. I'm engaging all these other books and kind of using them to cover over this possibility of being impacted. And we do that all the time. We are confronted with a new possibility, and we say, oh, no, I get that. I understand. If there's ever a conversation that both people introduce a topic and they say, oh, yeah, I get it, no understanding has happened. All they've done is kind of glossed over understanding. It's that they've kind of bypassed that whole process, because understanding is complicated. It takes a long time. If I'm trying to present a genuinely novel interpretation, it's going to require you revising everything you know about the topic we're discussing in order for you to understand where I'm coming from. That's a really involved process, and not many people are willing to do it. But anyway, that's the potential that reading can have in your life. And I'm going to go through those levels and show you how you can do the same thing. By the way, with the Martin Buber book that I introduced earlier, I got a master's degree in humanistic psychology, and we read that book in one of the classes. That's why I picked out this specific graduate program, because I knew a lot of the professors were influenced by this school of thinking. And so after a while, I was able to pick up this book and even more complicated books and kind of get to know the author through them. So it wasn't until, 7 years of college that I felt like I was able to read at an analytical level, and then another 3 years in a doctorate program that I felt like I was able to read at a syntopical level or comparative level. And I'll talk about a little bit of that as I go through. So we'll start off with the very simplest level, and And this is what we generally think of when we say, can you read? Or you can read, can't you? And this is an elementary level. This isn't elementary school level, although it's introduced kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Usually by third grade, they've reached what we call a third grade reading level, which means they can recognize letters, they can pronounce words, they know basic phrases within a language system. They have a large vocabulary. Whether or not they have facility with it or economy with it, that comes much later. But they have this vocabulary. They can pronounce words. And so, like in this slide, you see a really simple sentence: Jane sees Spot run. Now, at the elementary level, we don't care who Jane is or why she's watching her dog run or this other dog run or what their relationship is. We're not reading past the words. We're just pronouncing the words. Okay, Jane must be a woman. Spot must be a dog. Running is an activity. If we've learned this in like second or third grade, chances are we haven't read our language this way in a very long time, unless we come up to a word that we don't recognize and we're confronted with something, an anomaly in a sentence, and we have to reread it carefully and like pronounce every consonant. Oh, I mispronounced that word. Now the sentence makes more sense. And we go back to the elementary level, then we go back forward to the inspectional or analytical level. If you've learned a new language and you're reading it for the first time, you're probably reading it at this elementary level. You're not yet using the words to communicate something deeper or something meaningful. You're just communicating information. You're at the very level of finding the correct word and saying it, or pronouncing the letters in a particular way, or building that vocabulary. Anyway, that is elementary reading. Because most people have an elementary reading level, and elementary school is very good, or public school and private school is very good at accomplishing this, it's easy to say that we have a high literacy rate. So the majority of people in the United States can pronounce words, they can recognize words, they can pronounce sentences, but that doesn't mean that they can understand complicated ideas communicated through words. That's jumping to a deeper level. So when you say, I'm literate, or I have reading literacy, do you mean elementary reading literacy? You can pronounce words. A lot of people can do that. That's a really early benchmark. That's often the definition of reading. Of course I can read. I can pronounce words. What Adler and Van Doren do in this book is directed to, or they're writing it to people who can read. They're readers who want to become readers. And so that's it almost sounds like a contradiction. How can you teach someone who knows how to read? And that's the whole idea. A lot of people can read per se, but they're not reading at a very deep level. They're reading at an elementary or inspectional level. The book is about getting past that to an analytic or even a syntopical or comparative reading level. So the next level is inspectional reading, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on elementary because it's really basic, it's elementary. But inspectional reading, this is what college students are really good at. And so I want to appreciate that this is beyond elementary reading, but it's still not even close to where we're headed, which is analytical and syntopical reading. I have here in this slide a table of contents of a book that I'm working on. The table of contents isn't really finished yet, but this is something that you'd be interested in if you were at the level of inspectional reading. So with inspectional reading, you're usually going to the book with some idea in mind, some goal, and so you might flip in this book to the table of contents to get an idea of, all right, so what's being covered here? How has it been written? And so I'll see, looks like it's divided into 4 parts, and so one is goals of reading, one is approaches to different kinds of reading matter, different types of writing, the third level of reading, and the dimensions of reading. So those are the different parts, and then each of those has sub-chapters within it, and those sub-chapters have specific points that are made within it. And so just by looking at the first couple of pages, I have an idea of what these authors are up to. I know how they've structured the book, how they structured their argument. By looking at all of that, I can tell you, obviously, it's a nonfiction book. They're teaching through it. These are teachers that are writing. I can look at the copyright page and who has published it. So this is published by Simon & Schuster, which is a really good New York City trade press. They publish a lot of books, but only if they're really good, and so they have a lot of marketing that goes into it. So this must be really popular, a really well-written book. I can look at the back and see, looks like the New Yorker did a review of it, and the New Yorker is considered one of the best literary magazines in the world, so that's impressive. I can read a little bit about the book. I can see how much it costs, right? So what I'm doing is I'm kind of inspecting the book for information. And as a college professor who writes articles and books, I'm also interested in the references. And so back here we have all the different topics that are covered. It looks like there isn't a reference page, so this tells me it's not a reference book. The purpose here isn't, look how much reading we've done, look how much we've cited, look how supported our argument is by other scientific literature. So this is more of a teaching book, so teaching through demonstration, not so much by building like a philosophical argument. Notice what I'm doing right now is I haven't done any reading yet, but this is still part of the reading process. I'm sort of taking the book in by breaking it up into parts. I might even decide that I don't want to read the whole book. I might jump around and get a sense of what I'm really interested in looking for. So picking up this book for a course that I'm teaching, I'm thinking of what do my students need to know without having to read all 400 pages. And so I see 4 pages or 5 pages devoted to the 4 levels of reading, and then a chapter devoted to each one separately. And so I'll flip to the 4 levels of reading and see if in fact it covers them enough. And I've already looked at this, so I know that it sort of does. There's a paragraph and a half or so about each one, so I can provide that as reading for my students, and that'll give them a sense. That'll give them a foot in the door of what the book is about. I can read that one short chapter. I haven't read the whole book, but I get a sense of what they're up to. And so there's a lot of, in that chapter, there's a lot of, we talk more about this in chapter 16, we talk more about this in part 3, we talk more about this in part 4, but I'm still getting a sense of it. So again, this is inspectional reading. Am I really hearing the authors? Am I getting a sense of the argument that they're building? Kind of. But there is no relationship being built. I'm coming into with certain expectations, and I'm looking to see whether those expectations are being met just by kind of skimming through it. This is a really useful skill in a college course when you're covering like 1,000 pages of a textbook, and there's no way you're going to read through all of that in a semester unless you're really dedicated. And then usually those textbooks, and I'm somewhat guilty of this too as a textbook author, but usually the writing is kind of boring. It's not really engaging. There's not a whole lot of creativity with word choice. So it's useful to pick up a textbook like that and kind of skip around and say, all right, here's a topic I'm really interested in. I want to learn more about that. Or here's a topic my professor is interested in, so I'm going to focus on it because I think it's going to be on the exam. One more example of inspectional reading, and this is something that I've done very recently. So I'm the general education coordinator here at Albany State University, and part of that is assessment. So this was a book that a colleague gave me, Learning Assessment Techniques for College Faculty, and I just got this a few days ago. And the very first thing I did was flip to, actually the very first thing I did was looked at who published it. Jossie Bass, which is a popular education press. It's an academic press that focuses on higher education and secondary education. There are other good presses that aren't very good at education, so I know that this one must be well regarded in the community. And then I jumped to the table of contents to see what is it these authors are up to. And so I read the topics that are covered in each part, and then the subtopics, and even the table of contents. Look at this: 1 page, 2 page, 3 page, 3.5 pages. That's a really long table of contents, and those are double-sided pages, so like 6 pages. That's a lot. We're talking about a book that's 500 pages, but much bigger pages than the book that I just showed you. And what I did was look to see what I could skip and what was really important. And unfortunately, it's like, oh, this all looks really good. I'm going to want to read a lot of it. And so I started reading at the very beginning, because I skipped part 1 and started reading part 2, and I said, oh, wait a minute, I need to understand more of part 1. And so I went back. And like I said, this has only been a week or so, but it looks like I'm going to have a lot of reading to do if I'm interested in the topic that they explore there. But anyway, that's that practice. That's inspectional reading. And it's great to get into. And it's really important part. It's a really important part of the process. To give you another example, sorry, I said that was my last one. I was reading Spinoza. He was a 17th century philosopher. I was reading him in graduate school, and I didn't do that first. I just said, okay, I have 100 pages to read. I better start reading it, and just sat down and started reading it without realizing that he wrote in a very peculiar way. So he would make an argument, he would outline an argument, he would make the argument, he would review the argument, and then he would summarize that argument in a different form. There were scholia and theses and argumentation listed. There were 4 different parts of every topic, and I was like, what the hell am I reading? How do I organize this? Had I inspected it first, or taken a look at those different components and looked up what that meant, I would have realized that each one was like its own separate book. And so there was a logic to how it was organized, kind of like we have outlines today. We do introduction, main argument, conclusion, summary, conclusion, that sort of a thing. He had his own way of doing it 350 years ago, and that was what was common at the time. Writing style has changed since then. The printing press has changed considerably since then. So the printing press, now we have word processing computers and things like that that allow us to organize our writing differently. And so I hadn't done that, and I was surprised by it, bewildered by it. I had trouble reading it as a result. I'm not saying inspectional reading is bad. It's really helpful. It's useful if you're trying to get a lot of information very quickly. But in terms of having an impact and being changed by what it is you're reading, it's not going to happen at the inspectional level. That brings us to the analytical level. And at the college level, this is my goal with students. I want to see students reading something at the analytical level. They don't have many opportunities to do so, especially when courses try to jam-pack tons of information. For example, if this was a textbook for a class, and you've got 14 weeks to get through this, to read this at an analytical level would mean spending hours on each chapter, and there are dozens of chapters. That is a huge commitment. Reading it at an inspectional level, by comparison, each chapter has 3 different ways of solving a problem. So you would just summarize, all right, so there's 3 different ways of solving a problem. Here's how step 1, or here's how method 1 differs from method 2. You're just kind of summarizing what it's all about. You're picking out the strategies that seem most effective for you and then applying them. That is an inspectional method. But reading it to say, how can I change as a scholar, as a professor, as a teacher by reading through this and seeing how the authors sort of change through the process, that's not going to happen. So it's very difficult for college students to do this in a course that has a 1,000-page textbook, or they read 7 books that are all really long or really dense. But to read a chapter and to spend time with it and to slow down and read it at the speed that the author is writing it at, really catching the rhythm, if it's a short story or a novel or even a well-written essay. catch the rhythm of the author, and what's being communicated, not just in information, but also emotion, feeling how the author feels about what it is they're writing. All of that's communicated in writing, less so in a sterile textbook. But in this book, like, these are really brilliant writers, and they have great economy with their words. And so if you read it slowly, and I'm not saying you have to do that, but if you read it slowly, there's really some pretty passages. And I find myself smiling not at, oh, that's a good point that was made, but I like how the author omitted a word here. I, like most people, when they speak, they add all these extra predicate words. They add a bunch of extra adverbs, and I'll notice that they're missing from a sentence, and it makes a sentence just kind of pop a little bit more, flow into another sentence, and I just find myself smiling and enjoying it a little bit differently. And that's an aesthetic part, but to wrestle with the reading process the way that the author has wrestled with it, and to experience that, that is getting into the analytical reading. So some of the points here: reading for the sake of understanding. You're not just after knowledge. To read for understanding means I want to change as a person. I want to be transformed. My level of understanding is here, and I want it to go up here. I want to push that up. I want to push that envelope up. Now, to do that means I need to let go of what I think I understand and say that I may have room to grow here. Reading Martin Buber for the first time, I was here. I realized I needed to be here, but I had no idea how to get there. I could read the words at an elementary level. I could inspect it. I could see how the argument was structured, but I had no idea what the significance of it was. Something was missing, and it was my ability to get past the words. I only had the skill of elementary reading and inspectional reading, and I needed to have something a little bit more. Another way that Adler puts this is grasping the book, and that's a metaphor. But think of it, and he makes this point, it's like literally grasping a book, like when you hold it in your hands and you feel its contours, and its contours are felt like on your hands. When you grasp something that way, it's a more intimate connection with it. So to hear an argument and say, okay, I get it. I understand. Like, yes, that makes sense to me. On the one hand, it's like you agree. That really sounds like you just agree. But what does it mean to understand that? That's when you have the experience of, wait a minute, but if that's true, then that means... And then all of a sudden, the constellation of the way that knowledge fits together in your world comes apart, and then it's fit together in a different way. And so you thought that if A, then B, but now you're learning that if A, then C. And if that's true, then I've been looking at this the wrong way all along, and all of a sudden my perception has just changed. My personality has changed. Now, how do we do this? Well, it's a really active process. Elementary reading is active. It's not like you can passively pronounce words. You have to be looking at the words and saying, all right, here's the noise, here's the sound that letter makes, and here's all those letters together, the word, and what that's pronounced like. That's active. And then inspectional reading is also active. You're like flipping around, and you're like looking for bold and underlined words, and discriminating things perceptually. But on the analytical level, the activity is a little bit more personal. You're reading with an openness that perhaps what you know, what you understand about the world might change. And so if you're reading something you don't know a lot about, it takes a really long time because you're being introduced to words that you might have to go look up. And so every sentence is like, I don't know what that means. And so you look up the words, you put it together. All right, here's one thing it could mean. Here's another thing it could mean. Here's another thing it could mean. And as you do that, you can see that's a really time-consuming process. That was like my first time reading Heidegger's Being in Time. So it's this famously difficult book that was translated from German into English. And so I'm reading it easier to read translation, really, as someone who reads English. And it took me like an hour or 2 hours per page. And that book's like 600 pages long. And I was sitting, I like locked myself on the patio I was staying in at the time, and I would just read it page by page. There were so many like Greek words that I'd have to look up, and sometimes I had trouble finding them because the Greek words were like made up by Heidegger to like really fit the purpose. And so it was a very slow process. My understanding was so low, but it moved up bit by bit. And after I got the hang of the way that he spoke and the arguments that he made and what his points were, I had an idea of where he was headed. So my understanding started to grow. And the more I read him, and I've read him several times since then, the higher the level was. And I would read it again and say, like, I don't ever remember reading that before, because if I had read that before, I wouldn't think the way that I think. And now that I've read it, I think differently. That shows me that the understanding is continuing to creep up higher and higher. Now, who's got the time to read Being in Time 10 times? Well, if you're interested in reading for analysis, reading for that deep understanding, it takes time. And it requires letting go of the idea that you're coming into a book as an expert. So reading this book, How to Read a Book, or any book that you read in your college career or as a professor or as a teacher, you might be looking to a book for its utility. What can this do for me? That's inspectional. If you're looking for growing your understanding, this is going to be a transformative process, and it's going to ask a lot of you. That's when you sort of give yourself over to the author and you say, all right, you've got the next hour of my time. There's no time limit on it. And so, or you're not limiting yourself to, I've got to read this whole book in an hour. You say, all right, I'm going to give an hour to this and we'll see how far I go. And so you'll read it with an open mind. You'll be a little bit more aware of how the author is writing, what the author is trying to communicate, how the author is communicating, what that does to you. So you'll be open to the affective or emotional side. You'll be open to maybe the personality or character of the author. But then also, what is it the author finds so important that they've taken the time to write about it for you? All of that will start to come together, and you'll realize bit by bit, like your understanding will start here, and then it'll start to grow. It'll move upward, and you'll start to see the words differently. And you've had that experience when you go back and read it again, and new aspects start to stick out to you. That's why it's a great practice to read a book over again. If you're reading for information, you'll say, I've already read it, check mark. But if you're reading for analysis, there's no limit to the number of times you can read a book, unless it's a really crappy book, which happens. There are hundreds of thousands of books that are not worth your time, but the more you're exposed to books that are worth your time, and by which I mean they've been written by people that have been very careful with what they say and how they say it, and communicate things really in a really beautiful and brilliant and aesthetically pleasing way. Once you were exposed to those, you find out really quickly someone who's just writing really quickly and carelessly, and then you'll say, not really worth my time. Then you might just read it inspectionally and save the analytical reading for well-written, thoughtful writing. All right, so let's move on to syntopical or comparative reading. This is something that college professors do, advanced college students and graduate students do. The objective of like a review article, when you read a book and then you use that book and another semi-related book to like combine them to make something new. So it almost has become a joke, but like blending philosophies. Like this is a Lacanian, who is a psychoanalyst, a more contemporary like French psychoanalyst. who has interpreted Freud in a very unique way. It's become very popular among postmodern philosophers. So like it's a Lacanian take on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's conception of autism. So like all of those things are put together to create something new. It's not in Lacan. It's not in the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders. But this author has put those together to create something new. Now, what's the utility of that? Well, it gets published. People are reading it, so evidently there's something there. But in order to be able to do that, you need to really understand Lacan. You need to really understand the DSM and autism in that example. And what are the consequences of blending them in this particular way? What changes? And what are the consequences of those changes? This is a stepping back and seeing how everything fits together kind of issue. And if you write a dissertation, you're going to have to do a lot of that, because the first half of the dissertation is you saying, I understand all of these books and arguments and theories and histories and how they fit together, and you're going to use those to build a foundation of what your argument is going to be. And so you have to really grasp all of those analytically and then recognize how they fit together. And also, you need to fit them together in your own way. If you're following someone else's lead, then that's not really you. You're borrowing from them. You're not really growing your understanding. You're benefiting from someone else's understanding, and it's not your own. That's why the dissertation or thesis is a novel contribution. It's your own. I don't want to talk a whole lot about this because it's a hyper-sophisticated step. And Martin Heidegger, for example, argued that all of the, a lot of that, like 99% of that, isn't actual original thinking. It's just combining old ideas in a new way, or really combining old ideas in an old way and passing it off as something new. But a meta-analysis is one example, drawing things together, making comparisons, and so on. I've created a graph just for a visualization of this, and on this graph I'm showing two different types of learning, one being knowledge, the other being understanding, or information and understanding, and how each one is represented in those 4 levels of reading. And so at the elementary level, there is 0 information, 0 understanding, because all that matters is what's there, not what it means or what it means to me. And so if I'm pronouncing stop for the first time, like on a stop sign, stop, right? Like pronounce it. I don't care that I'm supposed to be stopping. I don't care that it means that someone needs to come to a halt. The meaning of it's irrelevant, and so there's no information, there's no understanding. The next level, that is inspectional. That is a lot of information, no understanding. And so we're moving up with information. And like I said earlier, I can inspect a 500-page book with really big pages in 15 minutes. I might even be able to summarize it, like come up with a brief summary in 30 minutes. That's a lot of information. But I haven't really grown. My understanding hasn't come up at all. I might be able to say a few things now that I couldn't say before, but there is no real understanding. Then we jump into analytical, and notice the information and understanding lines cross. And I'm making this up. Like, I don't have any data to support this, but this is my understanding of it. So they cross, which means if you're doing analytical reading, the information becomes less important than the significance of it. So when I read this book, I'm not interested in becoming the expert of, like these authors have become, of all these different forms of assessment. I want to learn how to improve our assessment of general education at Albany State University, period. So I'm looking for that, and when I find something that seems significant or useful, I'm going to deep dive into it. And I'm going to ignore all of the stuff that's irrelevant to me. So notice, I'm neglecting a lot of the information for the sake of understanding. And then with Syntopical, information stays at that much lower level, and then understanding grows a little bit more because I'm not sticking with what I can understand from here. I'm also pulling in what I know from other assessment experiences, and further developing my understanding of assessment and how it applies to the gen ed assessment here. So those are the 4 levels of reading: elementary, inspectional, analytical, and syntopical or comparative. And it would be a great practice if you want to really nail these down or dial them in. Practice each of them. So pick up an essay, maybe ask for a recommendation. I want to read an essay analytically, and do each one. All right, so like pronounce the first couple of words and say, like, okay, like that's elementary. Well, I've got no time for that. Like I can do that without thinking, and so then you'll skip down to inspectional, and so you'll look at, all right, how long is it? What's the title? Are there any references? What are the different subject headings? You'll do that and get a sense of, all right, so I have an idea of what it must be about. Then you've gone through a lot of information very quickly. You'll get a sense of what inspectional reading is. Then it's time for the analytical. So now you go and start reading and take your time reading, and you're asking, what is being communicated here to me, and what's its significance to me? How does it change the way that I look at the world? How does the author look at the world? How does the author feel about that? There are all of these questions that are going on, and you're seeing what comes up. And you'll read through it, and you'll say, what has changed? If you say, okay, whatever, that was interesting, and move on, you haven't done it. You've stayed at an inspectional level. Chances are you were thinking about something else. And then you go back and you read it again and say, gosh, this requires a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and then you're on to something. The more you practice that, the quicker you can get into submerging yourself into a piece of writing. And I would say don't even bother practicing syntopical unless you really know a topic and you've read a lot about it and you've read it all analytically, and then you'll take a step back and you'll see, okay, here's how it fits together, or it can be fit together this way, or it can be fit together that way, and each of them have their own consequences. And so on. Maybe I can do a more in-depth video on one of those topics, but that's a pretty elementary overview of an information-heavy overview of the 4 levels of reading as they've been defined by Adler and Doren.